the rubber band. Anyway. Please come back again during daylight hours when you can visit our wonderful 281-acre collection of trees, shrubs, and vines. Fall foliage should be peaking third week of October, last week of October. The drought has not helped with that, but that's our best bet here. So do come back. Our lectures, landscape, and school programs are supported by our endowment and also by memberships. So if you are not a member, we would love to have you become a member. And if you are a lapsed member, we'd love to bring you back on board. It makes this Arboretum work as a free resource for the whole community. Just a note, if you are returning to Forest Hills on foot this evening, I would prefer it if you paired up with somebody in a car. Most of the cars leaving here have to go past Forest Hills Station. So if you would do that rather than walking in the dark, that's what I would prefer. And we also have some forms that we've asked you to fill out, some feedback forms, and there is a kind of a beehive at the back of the room where you can put those forms in. To introduce our speakers this evening, we have Ned Friedman, who is director of the Arnold Arboretum, and he is also the Arnold Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. And he is growing our research program here and taking care of collections and making things home. So I'll turn it over to you, Ned. Thank you.
Hopefully, let me know if your eardrums start to bleed. This is actually something that we've been thinking about for a while. We've introduced a number of new public programs since I arrived here. You may have heard about our tree mobs that bring scientists into the collections to talk and engage the public in a more spontaneous way. You've seen the Director's Lecture Series, which this year I think will be as big as ever. And we've had many different kinds of formats, but one that we haven't engaged in is one in which a topic that is of current sort of social interest and really cuts across so many different lines of thought, economic, political, biological, you can imagine all the kinds of things that can get wrapped up into some of these topics, comes together in a room without a script, without a formal presentation, but rather with three experts who may have different perspectives. And the goal, Pam, if we can someone to is that we're on the way to Faulkner Hospital, so apparently everyone's dying tonight. So just none of you are allowed to do that. And so what we've been thinking about is actually creating a set of programs. This is the first inaugural program in which, rather than just talking in a sort of a scripted manner or a more formal way, you will actually get to see how people think. And the goal really here is not to simply give you a perspective, that might be useful, but to give you many perspectives. And that really is a way of starting a dialogue that you can have in terms of pursuing these ideas further at your own pace, and also engaging with your friends in various formats to hear what other people think. So we have the topic today, which is really around our exotics, invasives, non-natives. You can think of all kinds of terms that get thrown around. And oftentimes it's fair to say that these terms have connotations. Some people say they're bad, or they're not good, or they're not appropriate here. And how do we deal with them? What is the problem? Well, I've asked three people who are really good friends and also wonderful colleagues to really sort of discuss this sort of topic. So let me introduce our panelists tonight. I'm going to start with Peter Tredici, who is perhaps best known among the Arboretum crowd here. Peter has been at the Arboretum for more than 35 years, almost 40. He just officially retired from the Arboretum, which means, of course, now we can have him here even more, which is great. He doesn't have to go to meetings. And he can do all kinds of things. He continues to be an associate professor of practice in the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, where he's really led and pioneered efforts to get people who are in the GSD to understand plant form, plant collections, and some of the complexity, as we'll see tonight, that lies behind the introduction of plants into human-made landscapes. He's also an incredible botanist. He got his undergraduate degree at Berkeley, a master's degree at the University of Oregon, and his PhD from Boston University. And he's been awarded many things that are for his distinguished service. I'll just mention for those of you who are in the crowd at Horticulturals, he received the Beach Award just 2 years ago in England. So, first person to ever get it since, H. Wilson.
Steve Bomber.
Right, I take that back. So third person in the lineage here, so it's quite a nice thing. Brian Connolly, in the center here, is a friend and colleague whom I know from the University of Connecticut, and also because he served for many years, 6 years, as the state botanist for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So here's someone who brings a knowledge of the work that needs to be done within a political and governmental context to bear on all kinds of issues. He's a very, very fine botanist. He got his PhD at the University of Connecticut after having gotten his master's there, and then actually got his undergraduate degree at the University of Vermont. And he's been involved actually in some of John Seinlander's earlier efforts, Invasive Plant Atlas of New England, we'll talk about in a minute. But he's also the co-author of the Vascular Plants in Massachusetts, a county checklist first revision. So we have someone here who was on the ground at a very granular level looking at the very issues that are going to be discussed here. And he's just assumed a wonderful position as an assistant professor at Framingham State University in Massachusetts. So this is your first semester, I believe?
Yes.
So he should be tired. At least if I recall correctly. Last, I want to introduce John Seinlander, who is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut, an distinguished colleague and ecologist, population biologist, demographer, person who's thought very broadly about plants all around the world, works one day maybe South Africa, and the next day, I don't even know where you're off to, but traveled throughout the world and studied plants throughout the world. He received his PhD from Duke University with a master's before that at the University of Michigan and an undergraduate degree from Pomona College. Beyond all of his MSF grants and his extensive set of publications that the list, well, the CD was 13 pages or something like that, I decided to pare it down a little bit. But I want you to know that he's been very involved in various working groups about invasives in Connecticut. He's also actually the sort of the person behind a lot of the initiatives that have to do with this invasive plant atlas of New England, IPAIN, and a variety of other things that are going on here. So we bring these three people together. I happen to know that they do have slightly different perspectives. And believe it or not, while we were next door just trying to work out a little bit of food, the conversation began, which was wonderful. So what I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do is take about 3 to 5 minutes, and I will sort of make sure that their concept of 5 and 3 minutes matches the one on the wall and the clock, to talk a little bit about their own sense of the topic today, the background, we haven't scripted anything. And after each of the three have spoken, I'm going to pose some questions that all of them can begin to address. I think you'll discover, if I'm not mistaken from the room next door to our earlier conversations, it will require very little prodding to have a very interesting discussion. So thank you all for coming. And Peter, why don't we begin with you?
Okay. Thank you for that great introduction. Everything's bound to be a letdown after that. That's all I can say. One of the things that is, you know, this is always a somewhat charged discussion. Whenever you sort of say, okay, you pit it as natives versus non-native species. It's like some kind of horticultural smackdown or something like that. And, you know, what I often tell people, and I didn't say this to you, of course, is that, you know, I hate participating in debates where that's the stage is set, natives versus non-natives, because it's this tendency we have to dichotomize the world, to divide everything up into native, non-native, good, bad, etc. It doesn't leave a middle ground, and this is one of those issues where there is much more gray than there is clarity at either end. And so if you immediately start talking about natives versus non-natives, it tends to take the discussion in a direction that I think is inadequate to the task. And so I think one of the things that, you know, I think everybody knows, you know, what a non-native species is. clear. It's not native to North America. So we sort of know that. But the issue of what constitutes a native species actually turns out to be a really kind of a tricky question. And I'm going to give you an example. Out of the mouth of babes comes some very interesting things. So I teach at the Graduate School of Design, and landscape architects, as everybody knows, don't know much about plants, and they're doing a project on Cape Cod, and they were talking about Populus deltoides. Okay, that's the eastern cottonwood, which, as far as I know, that's a native species, And he says, I realized that Populus deltoides is invasive on Cape Cod. I said, what are you talking about? And he pulls out a range map from the USDA 1977, which is when those maps were first published, and you actually see that there's Cape Cod, Populus deltoides has this very limited range on Cape Cod. In fact, it's very limited range throughout New England. And in fact, what that map describes is historically the areas where Populus deltoides was recorded as a wild species. Since those maps were done, and in fact, probably even while those maps were being created, its range was spreading. It's now everywhere on Cape Cod. But it's interesting because there's a student completely, to my mind, misinterpreting this concept of what it's the idea that Populus deltoides is not native to Cape Cod because it doesn't show up as being on that 1977 range map. And so the definition of a native species is really based on these range maps that were produced in the 1970s and 70s that represent where the species was as a native plant, not necessarily impacted by humans. And if a plant is beyond that range, it's not native to that area. The most egregious example being the black locust tree, which was planted by early settlers because it was a very useful tree. It never made it past central eastern Pennsylvania. And so the state of Massachusetts has always considered it a non-native species because it wasn't in Massachusetts when Columbus or when the Pilgrims landed. And I feel as though, if this is, part of the definition, how do you actually define these things? Actually turns out to be a very complicated process. And, and then especially if you try to take a complicated process and then you try to legislate it through some act or you get the legislature involved, you just know they're not going to get it right. And so I think that, it's much more complicated. This is what I mean about gray, okay? What is native, what is not native, turns out to be a very complex process. I don't, and just to end, because I probably want to use my 5 minutes, but
He's good at the timing thing, and you can tell when he's from Berkeley. Just pretty.
Well, just one, and it is that what I'm interested in, and this is, I'm not so interested in, what was native here, what was not native. What interests me is what's happening in the world today as we speak, and what is this telling us about what the future is going to look like? What is our environment going to look like 20 years from now? I'm really interested in that question. And I think this whole idea of, when you look at a species and you ask the question, is it native or is it not native? I think that question does not actually have much, it doesn't actually explain much about what we see as happening in the world today. And I think it may have been a very important question at some point in the past, and I think with time and globalization and urbanization, this dichotomization between native and non-native species is becoming less and less significant.
Thanks, Peter. Brian, if you would take up the charge next, or
Certainly. I guess my perspective on invasive species or non-native species is mostly about conservation of biodiversity. About 3,200 species of vascular plants have been recorded in Massachusetts. About 1,800 are native. We can debate what native means, but for now, we'll stick with the contact, European contact. But and most of the introduced species behave themselves. Only about 10% or so actually become brutes and start to displace native plants, and also, which I'm becoming more interested in, is moving up trophic levels. So, you know, we might have these great Norway maple forests, let's say, you know, that are cooling neighborhoods and you know, preventing erosion, let's say. But what else? What's feeding on those? You know, what kind of Lepidoptera fauna do we have there? And you know, what kind of birds is that bringing in? So I'm kind of, my perspective is trying to get as many species into the future as we can, and sort of basing invasive, not necessarily on, you know, if it's here, but from another continent and it's behaving itself, is nothing to worry about. I mean, we have plenty of introductions, you know, dandelions and many other species that are non-native, but they're not really doing what I consider ecological harm. And then other things that you know, really concern me are vectors of invasive species. We're seeing lots of range extensions of things that are known invaders. We were talking about Japanese stiltgrass, and basically, I don't know what, Ted knows the exact numbers. Ted Elman from the New England Wildflower Society, but I think it was 8 years it basically took to overrun Massachusetts, and now occurs from Sheffield to Pepperell. Very, very rapid transportation of these non-native species. And so it's about the speed and the numbers, and can our local biodiversity withstand the onslaught of the numbers and the displacement. And I'm definitely not plant xenophobic. I love plants, you know, beautiful and interesting plants from all over the world, but it's more about the displacement of the local biodiversity, in my perspective.
Thank you, John.
I thought I would talk a little bit about where my sort of focus on this. What I do is to try to understand and predict how invasive species change over time in our landscape, how they move in the landscape, using a variety of different kinds of methods. I do modeling, I do experiments, I do direct observations in the field, and all of this comes together to try and do what a biogeographer does, and that is to understand species distributions and how that may change in space and time. Of course, what we could say is if we were here 20,000 years ago, all the species here are invasive because they were covered with ice. So in some sense, understanding that whole process is an important endeavor. I try to look at this objectively without sort of putting values, negative values on these, but clearly there are many invasive species that do have negative values. You know, either we don't want it, there's an economic cost to it, health cost to it, but defining what an invasive species is difficult. I thought what I would do is just go through a rather short list here of some of the findings that I have found, myself and my students and colleagues, about invasive species here in plant species here in New England. Number one, most of our aggressive invasive plant species are bird dispersed. And an invasive bird is a very good disperser of that, and that's the European starling. Most of our invasives will continue to spread in our landscape. They haven't reached their limit. We did some experiments in northern Maine, and many of our invasive species haven't made it there, but they do perfectly well in northern Maine. Invasive, and I've done some comparisons between invasive and very closely related native, closely related ecologically native species here, and what I found is that invasive species have much higher population growth rates. They perform much better. They produce more seeds. They grow faster. They die less frequently than the native species. Many of our invasive species have undergone natural and artificial selection. That is to say, cultivars were selected for. There was conscious selection for the most hardy individuals in botanic gardens. So they went through they went through artificial and natural selection, and in fact are genetically different than the species are in their native range. Many of our invasive species exploit vacant or open ecological niches. So when I went to Japan and China, almost all of the forests are filled with woody vines. And here we only have a couple of woody vines. So that essentially is like a vacant niche. So Oriental bittersweet would be an example of that. So anyone who's seen that expand over the landscape in the last 20 years would say, yeah, they're just filling up with woody vines. They thrive, and most of our invasive species thrive along edges, that is, edges of forests, edges of properties, hedgerows, fence rows, those sorts of things. Different species with different attributes are prevalent in urban areas versus suburban areas versus rural areas in terms of invasive species. New species are continuing to appear in our landscape and will continue to appear in our landscape given the massive amount of global trade that we have. And there's new species coming up all the time. And the final thing is that the invasive processes here in our landscape are completely different than the invasive processes that one sees in East Asia. As many of you know, we share very closely related forestry species and other species with East Asia here in Eastern North America. But the invasion process is completely different. The invasive species are completely different in East Asia than they are here.
Thank you. Well, as I was listening, I guess one of the things that I began to sense, we start with the concept that no matter how we classify these organisms, this is the reality. And you've just, again, emphasized it, that there will be more invasives coming, and that they have not reached their limit. And I sensed in Peter's initial comments that this wasn't necessarily a negative thing. One shouldn't necessarily place value judgments on these things, but one should understand what's happening. I think there's common ground on that. But it seems to me we could talk a little bit about sort of the pluses and minuses when invasives enter our ecosystems. I'm not saying static ecosystems. I think the point that we would have been under a sheet of ice right now if it was only at the glacial maximum suggests that there's very little that's native here as of 18,000 years ago. But one could distinguish what's been pushed up and down the east coast of North America from something that's crossed an ocean or come across the Bering Strait. Maybe we shouldn't, I don't know. So let's assume that ecosystems are in flux. I was reminded of William Cronin's book, Changes in the Land, which really began to emphasize that very little of what we take for granted is as it's always been. Your evolutionary perspective is really important. For those of you who know a little bit about evolutionary history, will know there were no trees just 350 million years ago. So, you know, everything's relative, but how much of this relative change is comfortable? How much of it should we be working to mitigate? What are the pluses and minuses? And Brian, I'm going to just start right in the middle with you, if you don't mind, and then I'm going to push out to the ends. But where do we stand? So let's assume we live in a world of change. Not only did Europeans change, but Native Americans changed, glaciation changed, evolutionary history has changed. There have been global ups and downs in temperature. How much of this should we be comfortable with? And what are the costs and benefits of the world we live in, and how much should we do with it? So just start to chew on that. And then I would encourage, you don't need to fully answer, but listen, I think at this point, I will let the panel begin to jump in a little bit. So if you just want to start that conversation rolling, and then Peter and John, if you don't mind, just reflecting on that, I think that would be worth doing.
Well, one thing working at DFW, I can see some of my colleagues here from the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife and Department of Fish and Game. The first thing is you have to pick your battles. There are certain habitat types that are minimally invaded in Massachusetts, but in general, if you look hard enough, you can probably find one or two invasive seedlings on every acre in the Commonwealth. I've found glossy buckthorn at the very top of Greylock, and you can find bush honeysuckle growing in the dunes of the Cape. So we basically don't have a pure ecosystem, and there's no going back. And that's the reality of it, is that we definitely have to deal with in our flora and always will. I don't see them going away. Basically, you have to really think about the resources that you have and your goals. You're probably never going to have a pristine ecosystem ever again, but you can tip the scales for the species and the ecosystem that you'd like to see, or at least partially so. And then one thing that we also talk about in the local land preservation is that we're preserving the stage. And so, like when we're talking about land conservation, we pick special areas, calcareous cliffs, high elevation, sphagnum bogs, places that have, unique abiotic characteristics, and the assumption is species may move in and out of there, but there'll always be, a unique set of specialists for that area. With climate change, with warming, cooling, these areas are likely to harbor unique biodiversity into the future.
Well, if I can follow up on that, because I really agree with what you say, Brian, about picking your battles. And I've been to a number of ecological restoration conferences, which is exactly what the practitioners of ecological restoration are now saying. And what I have found in my experience, that when you're evaluating what kind of site, can it be restored or not, the single most important criteria is the native soil profile still intact? Because without a native soil profile, it's extremely difficult to build a native ecosystem. So once something has been turned into farmland, where you plowed that soil profile, you've destroyed the layered structure. It's very hard to get back those native species. And so, a lot of the efforts of restoration, we think that, you have a plant list, you just put these plants in there. It's really all about the soil. And if you don't actually pay most of your attention to actually what is under the ground, the restoration effort is doomed to failure. It's not about a plant list. It's about the soil. And in my experience, if that soil layer has been drastically disturbed by construction of some sort or by agriculture, and you can see this in side-by-side parcels where one has been logged, where they've cut the tree down, but they haven't destroyed the soil structure, and the other has been logged and then plowed, and the soil structure is destroyed. You have totally different, distinguishable forests on either side of that boundary line. And so, understanding these drivers, it's not just, I want these species and I got this list and I'm going to put them in the ground and then you walk away. In most cases, if that's all you do, the invasives will just come right back.
So let me take us in a different direction here. So certainly targeted removal of certain invasives probably can be justified for economic reasons or health reasons. So for instance, there was a study done recently in Connecticut which shows that closely associated with Japanese barberry bushes along edges are white-footed mice, and white-footed mice are the major harbors of the tick with Lyme disease and the two other diseases. So in fact, you have much higher prevalence of Lyme disease and ehrlichiosis and other tick-borne diseases associated with these perfect cages which supply berries that the white-footed mice eat, which do wonderful along edges. So in some sense, even though you can go to parts of New England, which just is nothing but a solid cover through the understory of Japanese barberry, one could sort of say, purely from the standpoint of health, that maybe that is a species that should be eliminated. A second species, which is new on our block and created, and there was a special law passed in Connecticut, is yellow groove bamboo, which causes major structural damages to houses, to roads, to walls. It can actually zip up through the siding and come out the roof of houses. It can pierce concrete. It can come up through asphalt driveways. The question is that something that should be regulated because it causes economic
There should definitely be a warning label on that container.
There is no universal definition of what is an among federal agencies.
Because it's relative. I mean, right, an invasive species in one area can be somebody else's rare and endangered species, right?
It can be, so then what's the answer? That we should do nothing?
I didn't say that.
We can't even agree on the definition.
Well, I think that but part of the reason we can't agree is because it is to a certain extent, it's a relative concept. In one situation, this species is, and you've done a world travel, you know, the Phragmites in Europe, the European ecotype is actually considered to be a threatened species.
Well, Japanese barberry in Japan is a threatened species.
Exactly, and so, you know, and so I think, you know, and a part of our problem that I think is that we have these political boundaries. So Massachusetts has one set of regulations about native species versus non-native. Connecticut has a different set of regulations. So we've got these political boundaries that make no sense from a biological point of view. And we're trying to...
But even at the federal level, we cannot agree on this. There is no universal federal definition or guidelines for what invasive species are.
Well, it's also regional because we think of invasive species in an ecological sense in the Northeast, but as you get out west on the rangelands, it's more of an economic problem. Where you have like cypress spurge or Euphorbia esula, which I guess you can't even get loans for your farm if you have those species on the rangelands.
The tumbleweed is another one that is...
And I don't think out there they're really thinking about displacement of natives, but they're thinking about economics. So we actually have a kind of a dichotomy of how invasive species are looked at. And so we kind of put them all into this trash can.
And that has a direct impact on us here in New England. If you go out into the western states, the Midwestern states, there's millions of dollars devoted to the education about control of regulation of invasive species. You know, and in Connecticut, we have one part-time person who is responsible for. So orders of magnitude different in terms of the amount of money devoted towards invasive species.
Doesn't every county have a
Yes.
invasive species agent
In the West.
In the West, and they map out.
And that's all federal money. No federal money basically comes here to New England as far as invasive species are concerned. Almost all of the federal money goes to the West and Midwest.
Well, let me draw you back. So, I mean, it's illuminating to think that, first of all, we don't have a national policy, but one can argue that the regionalism is that, you know, there's a sort of a scale that one needs to deal with in terms of where the problems lie. Let me just step all the way back. Let's assume that there were no economic issues. Let's just pretend we live in that world. Let's put it in New England context. That all the invasives that we have here cause no health effects that are ill, didn't change the way that money was made. Why should I want or not want native plants? I mean, let's get to a more sort of the ethos of this. The first principles that says that I should want something and not want something else. Is it a problem that barberry covers whole fields? Because I think at a general level, one, especially if you think of the World Botanic Gardens, we celebrate plants because they're wonderful in and of themselves. So there's something that's a context here that I'd like to sort of uncover. So,
Well, certainly there's an aesthetic component. I mean, I don't think aesthetically most of us would like to live in a monoculture. I mean, maybe if you are in the Midwest and you're a corn farmer, you know, I don't mind.
well, let's imagine that we have invasives we can invade and not create monoculture. So we all can traipse through the woods and see things that are not good. Let's just ask the question, does it bother you? Is there something problematic about having a non-native species?
Well, Brian, you touched on that. I mean,
Right.
for sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's about the displacement of the native species. You know, but if
Well,
you
let's
know.
take the honest, that's all pushback. So
Right.
we have a little bit of eco-space here for the
Well,
honest, right?
yeah. Well, but the lianas often
They can do.
they can do damage to native trees and actually what's interesting about Oriental bittersweet is having Stacy Light, who was John's graduate student here, is that there's reproductive interference. That the Asian bittersweet actually appears to be preventing the native bittersweet from making seeds.
Oh, it's driving it into extinction.
It's driving it into extinction.
Absolutely, no question
that's one, native diversity is one plant in big trouble.
And I think also the way John described it, these niches, the liana, that would be a woody vine as opposed to a herbaceous vine. From my perspective, that's I call it a parasitic life form because its goal in life is to pull trees down. And so, if you want there to be a forest, when these species get established on the edge and begin to move in, it becomes a very serious problem. So I'm not disagreeing with
The Asian extinction forests are doing fine, and if you go to the tropics, they're all loaded with, so, so there's a few trees, that's part of the dynamics of the system.
Well, the trees are adapted there to having, to deal with weight load. And so there's been selective pressure for the trees to be able to survive the onslaught of lianas because they've been together for thousands of years.
And you could say, by the same token, following up with what Ned said, that over evolutionary time, the forests of North America will also adapt to the fact that we now have 8 lianas when we only traditionally had 2 or 3 in our forests. But
So just wait for a few minutes.
Well, this is interesting. I'm gonna take the conversation on a left-hand turn here. But there are organisms that are starting to utilize invasive species, and actually there are natural biocontrols starting to crop up. I don't remember the name of the fungus, but with the tree of heaven.
the Islanthus,
Yeah, Islanthus, there's a native fungus that's...
It's a fusarium, actually.
That's right, yeah, that's jumped onto Islanthus. So one question, this is, I'm just gonna throw this out here.
Pennsylvania, actually. Go on.
See what erupts. Well, so once these species get up to certain numbers, aren't other species going to provide environmental resistance and start to push them back?
I think
This totally doubles that.
That is a, I think that's a biological principle. It's a resource that's somebody's going to come around eventually and exploit it. But I want to take that and I'm going to raise you. Because let's suppose that you actually figure out what this fusarium is, you actually figure out how to cultivate it in the laboratory, and you now have a biological control agent for Islanthus, the tree of heaven, at your disposal. Do you then have the right to go around and say New York City, and Islanthus, by all estimates, is the most common tree in all New York City, is to make a unilateral decision that the world would be better off without Islanthus, and to begin an extermination project, program by injecting this fusarium fungus in all of the Islanthus.
So that experiment has already been done. It's been done with radiation. So we now have Asian longhorn beetle, we have ashborer, we have blue intelligent, we have gypsy moth, we have beach bark disease. We're going to have no trees here as a result of invasive pathogens and pests.
Well, I don't think we have to do that experiment. My guess, the fungus is going to do it on its own. I think that if you're a smart fungi, if you think like a fungus, you're going to make a lot of spores and you're going to get around.
Well, I see it as a moral, sort of a conundrum, because all of a sudden you've got this tool, and then because you have the tool, are you obliged to use it? And, I personally feel as though, if we're honest about the tree of heaven in urban environments, we're getting measurable environmental services out of that in terms of heat reduction, air filtration, soil building, and so on and so forth. I mean, it grows where nothing else will grow, basically. And the idea that somehow or other this tree doesn't belong there and should be removed, it just seems like a bizarre idea to me in an urban context. And I think this is part of the problem. You move out into the countryside, you begin to see it along the highways, and then you see it on the edge of the forest. Then all of a sudden, Islanthus becomes a sort of a bigger problem. And I think that's one of the, I've been portrayed as sort of on the side of the invasive species, but, I have, in many cases, limited my work to the urban environment, and I think this is part of the problem, is there is this contextual issue that in one context the plant seems to be fine, in another context it's a problem. And I don't know how to
Let's lead right into that, because that was one of the questions that I wanted to pose for some discussion. So we're now talking a lot about context, and so the answer to what you might do in New York City, place that has larger amounts of concrete than some of our uppermost reaches of Maine, it might be different. So how do these conversations play out when you move, let's make it a little bit more subtle, between rural and suburban environments? Maybe New York City isn't a difficult one. It's something that provides ecosystem services and grows and can't be killed because it's not watered. And you just look around Boston and you realize that lots of trees die from neglect. So maybe we're grateful when something actually, when neglected, can actually provide some sense of history. But it gets a little bit more difficult when we move into these wonderful figures of interlocking rural suburban ecosystems. How do we deal with that? There's a lot of planting going on in suburban ecosystems, and things are moving out. John, go right ahead.
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I just want to give a sort of, go back to something I said earlier, in sort of my introductory remarks here, is that the invasive species that are invasive here, the types of species that are invasive here, are completely different than species that are invasive in East Asia. And that all has to do with the cultural differences. In East Asia, all of the horticulture is done, by and large, except for some bedding plants, with native species. So if you go to Japanese and traditional Chinese botanical gardens, they only use native species, and they selected many different varieties from that. And as a consequence of that, they have a much different kind of invasive problem here. Here, what we do is, we select the unusual. It all started with the tulip frenzy in 16th century Holland of exotic, and that gets built up in here. So that has encouraged the introduction of exotics from basically all over the world, and that never happened in East Asia. They didn't send out people like this botanical garden did to search out all over the
Right. Well, that may have a lot to do with just our history of our cultures, and that they've been, basically there's been a continuous culture in the same location with those plants for thousands of years, and we're basically a transplanted culture from a different ecosystem, and so we haven't interacted with the native plants for nearly
Well, the same is true of Europe, so.
Right. Okay, so that's different there. Yeah.
But we have, but I would say, in Chinese gardens that I've been to, you do see a few non-native species, Magnolia grandiflora being a very prominent example.
Recent.
Well, last 100 years, but nevertheless, because that's really when there was no horticultural exchange before that, and when China was essentially closed. So, and the other thing is that when you go out into the countryside, you begin to see goldenrod, you begin to see sumac, you certainly see robinia, America's gift to the world. And so, I agree with you that many of the plants that are sort of invasive in Asia came through maybe forestry, a different venue, maybe not ornamental horticulture, but nevertheless, they do have an eucalyptus in certainly central Sichuan areas. I mean, they have, and those are forestry species that were planted on a broad scale, God knows when. And I think the situation in Europe is a little bit different, but, again, they have their own suite of black cherry, poison ivy, pokeweed, goldenrod, evening primrose, all these things that some
American.
Yeah, I mean, so I completely agree with your analysis, but I think that in China, the plants that have become invasive got there through different avenues.
Well, we have multiple avenues.
And yes,
here.
we have a lot.
I mean, a lot of stuff came in on ballast and, came in and feed and things like that. So we have multiple routes. And also, I mean, a lot of conservation organizations, planted autumn olive for birds and, multiflora rose for cover for songbirds as well. But we never answered Ned's question. So I mean, the urban suburban. So when we start to shift out into suburbia, is there a place for non-natives to provide ecosystem services out there? Basically, yeah.
Should we be comfortable with that?
That's a really,
we all do it. My yard is filled with exotics because, you know, I bought into it. And, you know, in some cases regret it, but it adds more diversity to our local system. I don't want to live without having Japanese maples.
Well, that's different than Norway. I moved into a house and I have an enormous Norway maple, and I'm not going to cut it down because it's my kid's swing tree, you know. And so, yeah, but no, it's a good question. But you know, for that, I don't think I could grow a replacement for it. But you know, I think I'd have to wait a long while. But I'm going to say this and see what happens. But everything in the suburban environment, I think you could find a native species that could at least do okay for your purposes.
I would, you know,
It may not be as good as like a burning bush. It may not be as colorful, but I think you could at least find a passable substitute in a suburban.
Part of the problem is there's never been an industry like there is in East Asia to develop cultivars of the native species. Here you can just count the number of different cultivars that you could actually get of native species here. It's just not really. There's thousands of Japanese maple cultivars.
It's true, but it's being worked on. People are developing
And if you go off to
your native bars.
go off to Walmart, or you know, what are you going to find in terms of native cultivars?
you might find a few. But to get back to Ned's question about suburban, because I think this is a really important thing, and you know, a lot of people live in the suburbs, and part of it depends on your definition of urban. And, you know, we tend to think as people that, you know, you define urban by the density of the human population, X number of people per square mile. And that definition works for human purposes, but from a biological point of view, what I have found, and I'm not alone in this, a lot of people agree, that if you actually change the standards by which you define urban as what the percentage of impervious cover, that would be paving or buildings, that will not accept water, that you can then begin to define urbanization as a process independent of population density. And there are several studies out there that indicate that when you exceed 25 to 30% impervious surface, and many of our suburbs are right in that ballpark, that what happens is you change soil characteristics and you change the hydrology, and you have effectively created urbanized conditions. And so many of these distinctions that people make between the city and the suburbs are in fact somewhat illusory and transitory, that in many ways our suburbs, you know, there's more paving happening, not less paving, and we're moving further along this continuum. And the plants are responding to that because a lot of the invasive species are driven by disturbance, and that disturbance is typically associated either with roads or with some form of construction or some disturbance of the soil. And so I think that it's this idea that we have the suburbs and we have the cities and we have the rural areas. On paper it looks great, but in fact there's a complete continuum, and the non-native species, whenever you have this urbanization, i.e. impervious surface, you find the plants are tracking that. Now, I don't know if that, you've done a lot of sort of research on this subject, this very subject, John, and, you know.
Yes, so certainly in urban settings, you find the species that are there are more drought tolerant. They are more tolerant of alkaline conditions because of all the time.
Right.
And they're tolerant of lead. So you go into urban soils and they usually have quite high levels of lead. So all of those things then will select for those species, those urban species, those particular conditions, which are going to be different than what we find in rural areas. And, and suburban are sort of in between.
Right. And I find that the studies I've looked at, that the proximity to the nearest roadway is the single factor that explains the distribution of non-native species. If you're looking for a causal agent.
I'm going to flip the discussion on its head here. So why do we have native species that do perfectly well in the urban landscape? I'm thinking about pin oak, silver maple. I mean, it's a hybrid, but London plane is half sycamore.
Yeah.
So a hybrid. sycamore would probably do just fine. It's just huge.
Except for the
And anthracnose, that's correct. So why do we have these native species that just seem to be able to get beat up in these urban landscapes?
Well, what's interesting is if you look at the species that are make the best street trees, so pin oak, American elm, red maple, sycamore, they're all bottomland species, and they're not upland species. So they're used to dealing with a wide range of conditions due to fluctuating water table, and the soil is relatively compacted because of the issue of saturation. So what I would say is some of our native species are pre-adapted to urban conditions, which is to say they come from areas in nature that resemble, I hate to use that word, but are analogous to the conditions you find in urban areas and therefore do well. In my book, while about 40% of the species that are common in northeastern cities are native to the Northeast. And inevitably, they're all sort of in nature found in disturbed and many times riverine environments.
So I've set you up a little bit here. Thank you. But I'm just wondering, so do you think we've actually screened our native plants thoroughly enough from these environments, and that there may actually be a whole set of native urban adapted plants that we just haven't gotten into the right place?
That's a great question. I would say yes. And I think about, Populus deltoides. When I look at that 1977 map of where Populus deltoides is, when I look at where it is today, I mean, that is so happy in the urban environment. Every drainage ditch I've ever seen anywhere in the Northeast is filled with Populus deltoides. It doesn't matter whether it's in the dense urban area or, in the middle of the countryside. I mean, it's an amazing plant. And you couldn't buy that to save your life. And we have no idea about the genetic variability that's available for that species. It doesn't root sucker like the quaking aspen, so it's in some senses, a more useful plant from a horticultural perspective.
So let me follow up on that, because you've raised an issue that hasn't really come up to this point, which is, if we're thinking about the broader issue, we've identified that there are issues that are unaddressed by government, whether it's regional, county, state, federal. There's complexity that hasn't really gotten a handle on all of this. Let's imagine, though, that we had a plan that said this is what we want to put in urban environments. You just mentioned something that I think many of us who garden are probably keenly aware of, is what you want isn't always what you can get. So how does the horticultural trade play a role? I mean, many of the things that we now deal with that are potentially invasive or disruptive to natural ecosystems are a commodity. And they're a commodity on which growers make money, sellers make money, garden firms that advise you about what to put in your yard make money, and they make money if it's not necessarily the most finicky plant. So there are a variety of things that obviously must play some role in what is actually going from a propagation facility into our yards and then potentially into our so-called natural lands. So let's talk a little bit about the horticultural world. Is it something where there's sufficient awareness?
The horticulture industry in New England alone is a $5 billion a year business. And a lot of money has to be made on something that's easy to grow and easy to propagate. I mean, you can still go to Walmart and buy Japanese barberry. All you do is take a cutting and stick it in the sand and it roots. And you can make a lot of money selling that. So in contrast to that, developing a new set of varieties or developing varieties out of native species is a costly endeavor. And it's not a market for it unless you make that market in some fashion. Now you can go to specialty nurseries and find weird things like variegated species, very, very variegated cultivars of some of our native species, but it's not mass market.
Well, there's a couple of exceptions, though. I mean, Islands Pertussilata, which are very holly, is you can get that.
Oh, yeah.
That's a native species that roots easily, and there's multiple cultivars of, and probably get that at almost any nursery. But I do think that there's probably a huge, wide open,
Well, I think the niche is still, I think the internet has changed a lot of things. And if you, go onto the internet, these small scale nurseries, you get small plants. Sometimes getting the stuff in size that a big landscape contractor wants for putting in a big job. But I would say, in my experience, I think I've done a lot of work with Magnolia virginiana, the sweet bay. And 20 years ago, that was a difficult plant to find, but you can pretty much buy that, certainly at the 6 feet size, anywhere. You might pay a little bit extra, but and I think about the native magnolias. I mean, I think the availability of native species compared to what it was 30 years ago is a huge improvement. I was a member of the Plant Propagator Society for many years, and I watched these radicals in the 1980s say, you guys should wake up and grow native species. And, the old guys were saying, no way, we're going to go with what we know. And, the younger generation is now completely in power. And
It probably makes up less than 10% of the market, though.
well, but that's...
10% that wasn't there before.
So let's say, is there a way, let's say aside from government, is there a way to at least have some sort of a set of signatories that say that we shouldn't be selling Japanese barberry, and we subscribe to a certain set of principles?
Right, well, in Massachusetts, you can't sell. You cannot,
But you might go across the state line, right?
you could.
Connecticut, it's not, it's illegal certainly to sell it.
It's, but yeah, certain cultivars have been dropped voluntarily.
Voluntarily, yes.
Because there was a study done on the fecundity of the different cultivars and the really high seeding varieties. I mean, we're talking like 10,000 seeds per year per bush. Some of these cultivars,
The ornamental fruit.
Right. And so there was a voluntary phase out of several of the cultivars that basically weren't making all that much money in Connecticut. And
So you refer back to it wasn't so hard to phase out.
it wasn't so.
And I know the difference is, and I'll just throw this in, the difference between Massachusetts and Connecticut, it comes down to one little detail, and it has to do with the definition of a species. In Massachusetts, we define a species as including all of its cultivars.
And hybrids.
And hybrids. And so when we banned a species, that just included everything. And Connecticut, they did not do that.
the
They
reason
defined the
for-
species differently.
The reason for that, well, we're in the process of revisiting this, but the reason for that is, I sit on the Connecticut Invasive Science Council, which is a state panel that's appointed. And on that panel, we're required to have members of the horticulture industry on that, and they would fight tooth and nail anything that was of remote interest in terms of horticulture or banning it. So that's the reality of the politics of the situation. And in part, horticulture in Connecticut is a $1 billion industry a year, so that speaks loudly.
In Mass, there's horticulturalists that sit on the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group as well. Maybe our vast horticulturalists.
They weren't thinking clearly when that definition of a species was inserted.
Well, we did get a ruling from the Attorney General's office saying that yes, that species would include cultivars, and that still got pushback from the representatives on it.
But getting back to what Ned was asking, there are actually people in the horticulture department, the plant department at UConn that are going and testing native plants right next to the parking lots at UConn. And so they're working on tweaking hormone balances for propagation to see if they can find a method that you can really crank out native species, and then they're planting replicated trials right next to the most urban areas that we get in stores, and see how they do. So there is research that's going on there, and then she does. This is Dr. Jessica Bell, and she then has a meeting each year where she invites people both from sort of the ecological restoration side and the horticultural industry to look at her plants.
You've led actually to what I wanted to probe. I know we're getting towards the end, but I do want to ask the question about universities, and in particular land-grant universities. We live in a country where every state has a land-grant university. It goes back to our agricultural heritage. When I think of the large land-grant universities, places like Michigan State University or University of California, Davis, and we think of these places where agriculture is a huge part of what happens within the context of the state. And then I reflect back to the land-grant university, University of Massachusetts Amherst, University of Connecticut, and look throughout New England. I never have had the sense at this point that people fully engage at the level that they think land-grant universities are necessarily part of the current context of discussion. Now, I know there are discussions going on at various universities about where land-grant aspects, the colleges of agriculture, can go. And, traditionally, it may have been about commodities, but can land-grant universities, particularly in New England, be more heavily engaged in discussions about ecosystem functioning, about horticultural trade, about the forestry trade, in ways that are more reflective of the fact that we're trying, I would say, to commoditize our environments, much in fact to protect them. I'm just curious, as you look at some of the land-grant universities within New England, are they, in a sense, properly engaged in what may be one of the most important discussions of our time? I know I'm in the right spot,
Well,
and I know two of you have been, just so you're very clear, I spent my early faculty career at the University of Georgia, and I could not be prouder of having been part of a public university with a land-grant set of colleges, and have seen the wonderful things that happen. But we live in a changing world, and what the University of Connecticut or the University of Massachusetts may have thought priorities in 1890 within a land-grant university context may not be at this point. So I'm just curious whether you feel that there's more to be done, or are they happening? Some of these changes.
There have been some changes that occurred. I mean, I've been at University of Connecticut long enough to see changes that, originally, University of Connecticut, in terms of the School of Agriculture, was trying to be like a mini Midwestern. They did some trials with corn and forage things and vegetable crops and these sorts of things. And, they've shifted their niches, and those into those positions. We used to have a pomologist and a range of different sorts. We used to have a whole layer with people looking at chickens, chicken teeth, and that sort of stuff. So that all has pretty much disappeared, and it's partly driven by local economics. So some of the things that focus now on are things like turf grass or golf courses. So there is some changes in that. I'm not sure, that they have been as innovative or as aggressive in terms of addressing some of the things that we're interested in. I mean, I think that Brian did indicate here, yes, they're trying to develop new sterile cultivars of some of the invasive species that could be reintroduced, so they're guaranteed not to be invasive. And then there's been a big push to come up with native cultivars. So there's been some, but it's been relatively modest compared to the overall structure of what goes on in the School of Agriculture.
Well, I think right now is a horrible time for funding. From what I've been hearing from colleagues at different universities, funding for this kind of research, just with the whole sequester and everything. I mean, there's so much backpedaling by the federal government. It's really difficult to get grants right now. I don't know if that's your right now, but.
Well, certainly in my area, the probability of getting a grant is about 5%. So for every 100 grants that go in, 5 are awarded for NSF. And it's a little bit better at USDA, but not much.
I also think, not being from a land-grant college, but remember Harvard was involved originally in hybrid corn very early in the institution. When I was cutting edge, Harvard wanted to be there. But I think the thing is that this issue of invasive, non-native stuff is really, it's as much an educational issue as a scientific issue. I think that, clearly there's a component to it that involves really understanding about ecology and so on and so forth, but then there's human behavior. People plant plants. And I think that's one of the things that is really, you know, we want to make this sort of invasive species issue about bad plants and so on and so forth, but it's really a sociological phenomenon. If we don't understand that 13 million kudzu plants were planted, subsidized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we don't understand that problem. It's not just about kudzu, it's about a policy that initially planted them. So, you know, we have to really integrate the sociological and the biological components if we're going to have any hope of doing anything about this in the future.
Thanks. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask each of our panelists just for 2 minutes to just maybe share a thought, something that all of us should take home as opposed to a summary. What do you think are the things we should be thinking about? And then I'm going to open up for just a few minutes of questions, and then people can get home. I don't know, maybe have children and babysitters, and we can certainly have informal dialogue. But I'll just ask each of you, what is our assignment as an informed citizenry, not only to learn about, but to think really hard about? What would you want each of us? And I'll start, John, with you.
Well, I would say one thing that can be done here, and this is going to be sort of a call for grassroots support, is to talk to your local congressman about actually allocating at least some funding from the federal government to focus on invasive species in our particular landscape here. Instead of sending, 99% of the funds for invasive plant research and control to Midwestern and Western states, we have basically no representatives on the appropriate committees in Congress that focus on invasive pest issues. So that's one thing. So we need, that can only come from sort of grassroots support. That would be one component. It certainly would address issues here. Of course, we're faced with many different issues. Prioritizing how funding would be spent. Do we work on, how do we decide which species that we're going to focus on? Is Mulberry a legitimate species to focus on? But how do we actually do this? What about new species that are just coming into the landscape here? How do we develop methods for detecting those that are going to be most aggressive? I think that if people were here 30 or 40 years ago, they wouldn't have paid much attention to Oriental bittersweet, and now it's just everywhere.
I guess my grassroots message is to learn about native plants and native plant cultivars, and actually speak to your local nursery people about getting them, and also just get to know your plants, get to know your local plants, so that you know what's in your local environment. And I don't know how many people know plants really well, but once you know invasives, you're like, they're everywhere. They're turn corners, invasive. Walk your dog, invasive. And so, I mean, they really are truly everywhere, and it's definitely an eye-opening experience to learn your plants and be able to identify them. And also, if you can, there are all sorts of ways you can report data online to understand the distribution of invasives. There's the EdMaps, which now the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England is highly touted, or you can still submit data through iPaint. And so this, if you submit data through these online databases, we start to get a real picture of where the plants are. If you look at those distributions we have currently, they're all way underpopulated. There are many, many, many more places where we have invasive species than is known about sort of in the common open source knowledge base.
I guess 2 minutes, that's a tough assignment, but I would say that, for me, the biggest issue we face is really this changing environment in which we're living, climate change, urbanization, globalization, and the idea that, we're going to deal with those issues by somehow going back to an ecology that used to exist doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We need to, move forward and come up with some really creative, forward-looking solutions. And I think as part of that, I've been miscast in a lot of roles over the course of my career, but one of them that I'm not advocating between, you know, non-native and invasive species. And there are a tremendous number of non-native species that are not invasive. And not only are these useful plants from an ornamental horticultural perspective, but they also are going to be very important components in our street tree flora. I mean, look at all the species that have been taken off the street tree list by pests and pathogens that can no longer be planted, or they are in fact invasive, like the Norway maple. Where are the street trees of the future going to come from? And so, you know, this idea that everything has to be native, I think it's too extreme. We need, in order to deal with the problems we face, we need a middle ground that allows for both native and non-native species, which is in no way saying that I think we should be planting invasive species.
Well, I'm going to take just a couple of questions. I'll ask, first of all, that the questions be tight so that we can get there. And then I'll also, of course, keep all three of you on a short leash so we can make a little bit of a move around, because we only have a few people who seem to be interested in the topic tonight. So I will start right there.
I'm a non-professional, but I'm interested in your opinion of some of the controls that have been introduced, whether bugs, I guess, for Phragmites. Is that a success possibility? And not just that one, but
Yeah, I don't know what's been released for Phragmites, but there's been the Gallicella for purple loosestrife. Yeah, that's been a
That's a success story.
Yeah. But there is a little bit of collateral damage, but not much. It does get onto Lithromelatum, which is an endangered species in the western part of Connecticut and Massachusetts. So it's a native congener. But that's about the only collateral damage.
But I would say that there's many examples of which introduced control agents have gotten out of hand and then gone off and attacked other
But not
species.
recently. That's all.
Not necessarily in our other parts of the world, it's very common.
Right, but that was like of the past, you know, just putting like these generalists, and like we're over that. We're not releasing generalists anymore. We go and we select specialists, and they test them extensively. You know, USDA, APHIS, and they are tested on like all the relicas and all the economic plants. And so
Yes and no. There's a famous story of the hawthorn fly switching to apples. So there's
Right.
evolution going on. So there is that potential, and there is some danger.
there is some, but on the other hand, it is so useful to have something out there that will go out and seek and destroy for you, instead of, you know, all sorts of human labor and resources going towards control.
So the answer is it's complicated.
So I'd just like to offer an example of a tree species that fits what Peter was just talking about, would be a mulberry. And we have a white mulberry that is non-native, but as far as I know, it's not considered invasive. It's hybridizing with our native species. I'm guessing that the various insects that live on our native mulberry recognize the white mulberry as food as well. So
You've got an expert here on mulberry.
Yeah, that mulberry, it can get weedy. You definitely can see it in native ecosystems, and very close to the native red mulberry. But native red mulberry, man, that thing is on the ropes in the Northeast, in New England. It's probably one of our rarest trees. I'm thinking basically the folio range is the only viable population in southern New England. So, you know, I love to eat white mulberry, even though they're not white. There's a rare white form, but white mulberries, I love to eat them. But, you know, I can go either way on that species. I don't think it's horrible, but, you know, definitely where it's anywhere near a red mulberry, I would get that out of there.
So context.
The context, I pick my battle lines.
Yeah.
I've been pulling garlic mustard, 10 feet of land between my house and my neighbor's house for 9 years. It is astonishing now that I finally think I got it. The amount of native plants coming in is unbelievable. Does anybody know, my question is, how many seeds come from one flower of garlic?
Flower?
Well, there is data on that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not, well, like in one.
Well, we have to.
Right, you're right.
I mean, it's variable depending on where where it is and how well it's
The
doing.
amount of
So-
seed that must have been in that soil.
Yeah. Is it maybe 20 flower, once a week?
But there'd still be a seed bank and there could be all
Well, the
kinds
seed
of.
bank's supposed to be relatively short.
Yeah,
I'm surprised. Yeah.
Supposedly, there is an
Yeah.
ecologist in New York who says that if you just wait
It will go
10 or
away.
20 years, it'll go away.
They're lost.
But, you know, I went out, I spent part of the summer in Michigan, and this year was the first time I saw garlic mustard. It never was in that forest, and all of a sudden, I found a couple of populations of that. So I'm going to spend time actually eradicating that, because otherwise it'll just spread out to the forest.
Yes, next.
I actually wanted to ask the panel to reflect a little bit on the word restoration. Peter, I think you started that discussion, and I think I know where you stand on that, but I might be wrong. For many years, I've been teaching design landscape preservation / restoration, and I've always been extremely uncomfortable with the word restoration, meaning it has a wonderful cultural connotation and a romantic, it's a feel-good word, but you don't really restore a landscape. You change it to reflect an earlier period, but it's not the same landscape. But the term ecological restoration is so prevalent in the literature. Is it real, or is it simply, is it a scientific idea, or is it a cultural idea?
Good question.
You change it, you
Yeah,
don't
I mean, yeah.
take it back.
Well, first of all, we oftentimes have no idea what was actually there
That's
in the
right.
first place.
Right.
So it's kind of a best guess, and we're tipping it, you know, it's kind of a way we're valuing native species and certain types of native species that there's a planned objective for. So it's really, it's often a value judgment. And so I guess it's more of a cultural or you know.
But there is a scientific society called the Ecological Restoration Society. They have their own journal. So there
Yes,
are
no, I
people
know
who
that journal,
who
but
are
I
or
think
scientists who do focus on that. I guess the question is, what do you restore to?
exactly.
Given the
I
dynamics
don't
of the
think
landscape.
there's a sense that you're pulling something back in time, which you don't do. You never do. You're changing it to reflect something different, whether it's an ecosystem or it's a design landscape form. I still think inherent, I haven't looked at it recently.
Well, in Massachusetts, Phyllis, the definition of a non-native species goes back to the Pilgrims.
More or less.
Was more or less wasn't here when the Pilgrims landed. So that same sort of mindset is part of the restoration. You know, if you're going to restore something, it's got to be native species, and that species hasn't been here when the Pilgrims landed. So that's a pretty broad definition, but I'd say, strictly speaking, that's how you would have to define it. Now, a lot of people don't use it that way. In fact, there's a much broader sense of restoration, which means restoring ecological function, means just getting rid of the invasive species, and what happens next may or may not reflect what was there
Right,
before.
but I think
But that's
that
also
the nature of
restoration.
that is not restoration, it's change. And so.
That's
the term
different. But I mean, it's
restoration just
called
sort of flies
restoration.
around.
But also there may be species restoration, where you're conducting active management, and it may actually, you might be doing something novel in an area, but your target is to restore a species, to increase its number.
Yeah.
But you may actually be cutting down a forest to
Yeah.
create grasslands for endangered species, because where the grasslands were is now under development, and so the original habitat's gone. So you have to make new habitat to keep those species in our general geographical area.
I'm wondering if each of the panelists would offer the one or two most invasive species, if there's something that's going to be cut in, so.
One or two.
The highest, I mean, most immediate danger.
Well, the one that's on our radar now, there's some discussion as to whether or not it is invasive. Some people feel that it's not, doesn't meet the definition of invasive, but it certainly is an aggressive alien that's spreading rapidly all over the place, and that is yellow groove bamboo, which can be this thick, and you can actually watch it grow. And then, like you mentioned, it can grow up through concrete. It goes up through floors, up through siding in houses, and people are using it in urban guerrilla warfare. They don't like their neighbors.
What would be your hit, Ryan?
Well, getting bigger, but we have released, Department of Ag Resources and Department of Conservation and Recreation have actually released the weevil for it. So.
Well, from my perspective, the plant with no redeeming social value would be Oriental bittersweet. You know, I like trees.
People use those for weeds.
Oh, yeah. I like
Flower arrangements.
I just,
I almost have to think that that's the perfect note to end on. And I'm pretty sure it is. I want to thank all of you for coming today and for being part of our first launch of a set of discussions that will continue at the old Arboretum of these kinds of societal issues where thought and even some vigorous discussion is the best thing that we can do to educate ourselves. If you have any feedback for us, because this is our first program, please put it in the back, in that box. And I want to thank all of our panelists for thoroughly enjoying the day.